Hi, everyone. Sorry for the delay there, some technical issues. Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Claire Samuel, and I run Feminist Photography Network with Jennifer Long. Today, we're both speaking to you from what is now called Toronto, but over thousands of years, this land has had many different names and has been looked after by Indigenous nations such as the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Many of whom still live here today. Excuse me, sorry. Land acknowledgements are a way that settlers like Jen and I can try to render visible the colonial system that we're part of that continues to oppress Indigenous peoples in this country. They're also an opportunity to express our gratitude for the earth that supports us and allows us to come together and share discussions like this. So I'm going to pass you over to Jen now, who's going to tell you a little bit about FPN and introduce our moderator.
Hello, everyone. So Feminist Photography Network is a shifting collective that's led by Claire and I, and our projects emphasize support amongst artists rather than competition. And we aim to humanize the arts process. Using grassroots strategies, FPN strives to expand resources, representations, and opportunities for feminist lens-based creators. Under the umbrella of FPN, we've organized 6 exhibitions, a film screening, and 3 peer-to-peer online residencies. Today, I'm thrilled to announce that with the support of the Canada Council, we'll be piloting new programming in September entitled FPN Island. This immersive intergenerational residencies will be taking place at Artscape Gibraltar Point and focuses on professional development and mentorship for women identified and gender nonconforming artists. We'll be launching an open call for this initiative in May, so please keep an eye open for that. Now I'd like to share with you a little bit of information about the online residencies we've been running, because that's what brings us here together today. Initially partnering with Wildfires, Women's Photography Network in Scotland, and later expanding, a group of photo-based artists in Canada and the UK created a supportive and inspiring community on a private blog. Each month, everyone would post new work or research, and 1 week later, they would make a feedback post for the person they were assigned to that month. This structure created a motivating sense of accountability, encouraged us to carve out time to focus on our practice. The residencies have resulted in many rich friendships and creative collaborations, both nationally and transatlantic. We have completed 3 rounds of online residencies, with the 4th one commencing later this year. With the support of the Canada Council for the Arts, we are here today as part of the web exhibition Identity, Connection, and Place. FPNexhibit.com showcases work by 16 artists who have participated in these residencies. In addition to the online exhibition, the site also includes 7 commissioned texts and recordings of our live events. An on-site exhibition is happening right now at A Space Gallery, with an opening reception happening from 2 till 4 today. We hope you can join us there. And now I'd love to introduce our wonderful moderator for the day, Liz Akarinko. With over 15 years of experience in the field of contemporary art and photography, Liz Akarinko has delivered large-scale, complex projects, working closely with a variety of artists, organizations, and institutions. Building long-lasting connections, including working with Wedge curatorial projects, the National Music Centre, the Dunlop Art Gallery, Critical Distance Centre for Curators, the East African Photography Awards, and the Scotiabank Contact Photo Festival. Ikarenko received her MFA in Criticism and Curatorial Practice from OCAD University and has taught at Toronto Metropolitan University and Sheridan College. Worked on publications including Maclean's, Public Journal, Mice Magazine, Black Flash, Akimbo, C Magazine, and most recently contributed to Aperture's As We Rise Photography from the Black Atlantic. She is the inaugural curator, collections and art in public spaces at the Art Museum, the University of Toronto, and co-founder of the Ways of Attuning Curatorial Study Group, and a member of the curatorial committee on the 13th Rencontre de Bamako African Photography Biennial in Mali, West Africa. So thank you so much, Liz, for joining us today and for moderating this panel.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Claire. I'm really honored to be here and to have been asked to moderate. I'm super excited to be in conversation with these 3 amazing photographers, Margaret Mitchell, Faria Aliyah Shah, and Arpita Shah. So I think probably just to start and to just let everyone know of the structure for this afternoon. I'll introduce the bios for each photographer, and then they'll present on their practice. And then afterwards, we'll get into some questions and then open it up to the group for more questions and conversation. So with that, I'm going to read Margaret's bio, and then I'll let Margaret take it from there. So Margaret Mitchell is a Scottish photographer living in Glasgow. Her work ranges from exploring communities and children's worlds to long-term projects on social inequality. Bridging psychological and the social, her practice concentrates on the complexities of people's lives with an emphasis on place and belonging. Recent projects include a new body of work on housing precarity, home and belonging, and a commission from the University of Glasgow, where she reflected on emotional spaces at end of life. She's exhibited widely, including at the Scottish National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh and at the National Portrait Gallery in London. Her latest body of work, An Ordinary Eden, opens at Street Level Photoworks in Glasgow next month. Her book, Passage, with Blue Coat Press, asks questions on the nature of disadvantage and privilege in a study over 3 generations. Her work has been acquired for the permanent collections of the National Galleries of Scotland and the Martin Parr Foundation. Recognition includes within the Marilyn Stafford Photo Reportage Award and the Sony World Photography Awards, and work has featured in The Guardian, The Correspondent, and The New Statesman, among many others. So welcome, Margaret. We're so happy that you're here, and I'm excited to see your presentation.
Thank you very much. Do you want me to just start sharing? Shall I just share my presentation? Is that
sounds
okay?
great.
So I'm going to try and get this up. So I'm just going to I'm going to let this play as sort of talk sort of generally about my work. I thought it would be useful to show this real overview of, I guess, 30 years of work, which is quite, in some ways, it's quite a challenge to try and bring that into, a short period of time. But that's kind of what I'm trying to show by showing this kind of, this set of slides here. And at the moment, I'm sort of going through sort of early documentary work, because I think what pulled me into photography was really the ability to tell people's stories. And I was really intrigued by lives that I knew well, so including my own family, but also the lives of others, people that I would meet, and sometimes I would meet them through things like jobs that I did. And I was interested in how I could actually use photography to actually convey aspects of their lives to a wider public. So a lot of this work is, going back to like 1990s. But what I realized recently is that things that I've been doing back then are effectively pretty much what I'm doing nowadays, which is quite interesting in some ways. And I've kind of just finished 2 major bodies of work recently, which are now going on to exhibition, both sort of together, sort of in very sort of close time span. And so it's quite, I'm sort of at this end of this period of working really intensively with people and their stories that have been happening. And I'm finding it quite, I always feel like I need this period of rest in my own mind to try and evaluate that. So it's always quite difficult to come along and say, these are exactly the findings that I have from those bodies of work. And I think that what I do a lot of the time, there's even, I think on the FPN exhibit on that website, I've actually got ongoing work on that website, and these photographs are actually from that. And that's work that I started back in 2019, but I don't feel like I've really arrived at a place where I can say, this is how that work should be presented to a public. So I like to take my time with my work. I don't like to sometimes take photographs and say, I'm straight away going to put them on display and see what the reaction to that is. When I did this work, which is family, back in 1994, which is my sister and her children, and I was looking around issues of inequality and stigma and identity. And it was a very sort of political project. You know, it was the politics of it that really pulled me in to her story of being a single parent living under the political landscape at that time. And when I went back to that project, it was over 20 years later, and I was interested in what the path of their life had been, basically, and why that had happened. And I felt like, oh yes, this is a really, you know, political message as well, but it was a really, really personal message at the same time, because I was expanding on all these sort of very, very familial stories for myself. And the way that I work with people is that a lot of the time when I'm working on these extended projects, so sometimes I'll do projects which are like one-off images, for example. I like to do that kind of thing where I'll go and maybe do, you know, a picture which then maybe becomes a series. But I also work on these much more longer term things where I feel it's more like it's like an investigation of some sort, where I'm starting with this question and I'm trying to see if at the end of it, I can have an answer. And that's kind of where I'm at with a project that I'm just finished at the moment. And there's another one that I've just finished where I don't feel like I formulated that answer as well. So I won't actually show that work until I've actually done that. But the work that's going on at street level, the ordinary Eden work, it started off from me looking at questions which had actually came up through previous work as well. And I was sort of interested, I was building on that previous work, and I wanted to explore people's sense of place and their sense of attachments, and when they were living in precarity, basically. And obviously a lot of the themes in my work recently have had these sort of themes around this inequality of, you know, unequal living. And this is from an ordinary Eden, this work here. And I really feel like this work started from that question as well, about what it was actually, you know, like for people to live like that. How could you actually have a sense of place and belonging when you were living under a situation which wasn't stable? And I think at the end of the work, I sort of came up with this kind of thing where I thought, well, perhaps looking for the roots of it is actually not the most important thing, but actually realizing how society is responding is actually the more important one, because one of them is a very long-term kind of approach where we're looking at the roots or why things happen, and the other one is actually something that we can try and address in the short term. How do we actually make these issues better for people in the short term? So I'm really excited about showing that work, and there'll be a website that opens at the same time called ordinaryeden.com, and you'll actually see some of those stories and how I've actually arrived at formulating these kind of questions. The work at the very end there was work that I did as a research project with the University of Glasgow, and that's the one that I'm kind of formulating how I think it should be presented. It was a very, very challenging but also very rewarding project, one of the most rewarding I've worked on, because I was working with people at end of life, and it was a huge responsibility to take that kind of work on, basically. I'll stop screen sharing because I've kind of shown quite a sort of variety of all that.
Thank you, Margaret. This is really
Hopefully
great.
Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah.
as I rambled my way through.
Oh my gosh. Well, you're a beautiful rambler then. And I'm really excited because, yeah, I've got a number of new questions as well. But I will go on to Faria. So I'm going to read your bio and then share away. So Faria Aliyah Shah is a lens-based artist based in Bradford, Ontario. She holds a BFA in photography with a minor in integrated media from OCAD University. Using photography, video, and sound installation, her practice engages photographic history and explores identity formation through the colonial gaze, race, connectivity to land, and collective memory. Shaw was the 2019 recipient of the John Hartman Award. She currently is a member at Gallery 44, the Center for Contemporary Photography, and Women Photograph, an organization that advocates for female-identified and non-binary photojournalists. Shaw has exhibited internationally in Asia, Europe, and North America. So happy to have you here, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me share screen. Make sure it's the right screen. There we are. Okay, can you folks see that okay? Wonderful. Okay, sounds good. So I kind of wanted to start with my practice after I moved. My family, I was originally from Edmonton, Alberta, and my family moved when I was about 7 years old to Houston, Texas. And this was a very important kind of phase in my life, the period of 7 to 14, because I was involved in dance and I was around so many people of color. If you could imagine being in Alberta in the early 80s, 90s, and my family was there from maybe the 60s through the 70s and continued to be there. It was a very, very white space. So this was the first moment that I saw people of color in prominent roles. Here I am with Lauren Anderson, who was the first Black prima ballerina for the Houston Ballet Academy. I danced alongside her in the Nutcracker when I was a ballerina way, way back when. But I like to start here because it was kind of the cornerstone of not only how I think about myself in the world and my reflection of my place, but the idea of kind of dance, movement, an awareness of my body. These are kind of principles and elements that formulated when I was younger and continue to kind of show up in my practice. Later on, I completed a series of work called Part of a Complete Breakfast. And within this body of work, I started to think about historical and archival media. I started to play around with video and clippings and kind of reworking histories to tell a new story or to uncover stories within that history. I find photography to be such a vast space. Image viewing and making is a beautiful process. Images are all around us. And so with this particular body of work, I wanted to really reflect on the idea of what is behind an image. So Part of a Complete Breakfast stemmed from two breakfasts that I consumed when I was younger. Funny enough, living in Houston, Aunt Jemima syrup and cream of wheat, which is a porridge that my family would often eat in the morning. And I wanted to uncover and unpack the histories of those the images that were on the labels. It was my first iteration of thinking through kind of the deeper history of an image and what exactly are folks trying to sell and reinforce when we use imagery. So I used images from Gone with the Wind and a minstrel show to really talk through what those images represent in relation to Black life. I wanted to share a glimpse of my process because it really hasn't changed over time, and I'm kind of happy that it hasn't. It changes in different ways, but I'll just kind of, let you kind of sit and watch a bit of this. In terms of how I make and how I create is a very exploratory way. I don't always start off with an image. Sometimes there's an idea, a reflection, an article, a song lyric, and then I kind of riff off from there. And perhaps it's something that I saw, listened, or heard many years ago, and it's something that I've been thinking about for a while, and I try to unpack it within my work. In the middle, you have family images. So family archives are definitely something that I work with on an ongoing basis. I'm still trying to understand my place in this world, my identity. My family is originally from South America, but beyond that, come from India and Africa and other places. So I'm really trying to have a better understanding of all of those influences on my identity and how I identify myself, and then how other people perceive me, and how I'm treated by those perceptions. On the left, I have images of material exploration. Again, oftentimes I'm looking to kind of play and create. It's really hard for me to decide which avenue I'm going to go with. I like to kind of let the medium play a little bit, or play within the medium, and then see what's the best avenue to tell a story. And that resulted into my first, I think, grand series or fully accomplished series, which is called Prefix. Prefix was a meditation on my identity, thinking about what it means to be West Indian, Guyanese, Canadian. How does the colonial gaze impact those things? How does the male gaze impact those things? How could I tell a story about my life and how I show up in space? And so within this body of work, I looked at representations of feminism and how it clashed with the ideas of Black bodies, or looking at teacups and drinking tea in Guyana, this colonial kind of tradition that was brought to this space that, you know, still lives in, represents within that space. So yeah, this was an exploration of a self-portrait without using the face. I also wanted to kind of see if I could tell the story, unpack the story of what self was without relying on features of the face. So exploring an uncanny self-portrait was something that I started to kind of play around with, and from a studio-based practice, these are visually some elements that still kind of come up within my body of work. Alongside this body of work were steeped tea bags on what I would consider colonial-based fabrics, and gradually the stain around the tea bags would get around the fabric would get darker and darker, contemplating the idea of colorism in conjunction with you know, the trajectory of this body of work. So wanted to highlight that as well. The body of work has lived in many, many different spaces, and I'm really proud that it still has an opportunity to speak to a variety of individuals kind of over time. I think that's a really beautiful thing, especially when a work is so personal. If it still has the ability to kind of reach an audience beyond its conception, that's really exciting for me. Here was at Union Station, which is a large train station in Toronto. And most recently, it's being displayed in Calgary, close enough to my hometown. It's still pretty far, but close enough to my hometown, which is really lovely that family are able to kind of go out and see my work. A few years later, I could put together a piece called Billy Says Strange Fruit, and it was again, looking at the idea of self-portraiture, but in a little bit of a different way. It wasn't just a contemplation of my personal identity, but thinking about Black lives in general. Around this time, I was witnessing, and I think we all were witnessing, an influx of police violence, in particular in the States, and having such a close relationship to the South in America, it hit me quite hard every time an event happened. So I really wanted to think about how I could respond to the events that were happening, and I created this body of work called Billy Says Strange Fruit. The song Strange Fruit, the poem Strange Fruit, had such powerful resonance in my life. Again, having connections to the American South and understanding slavery in a very particular context. I wanted to unpack the history of, or relate the history of photography to image making in this way. So let me kind of unpack this a little bit. Flora and fauna is such a large part of the history of photography. And I remember being a student and finding several images of flora and fauna and its shapes and its beauty, and text written about it. But when it came to Black lives, it was really difficult to find that level of nuance. So my idea within this body of work was to elevate Black lives on the same platform of the reverence of flora and fauna. And what happens when we put them side by side. So the piece is a meditation of that. My uncle was a revolutionary. He was a Black Panther, and I thought about him a lot while I was building this story. And these are some images of, again, the flora and fauna that kind of shows up in historical context while studying photography. The body of work moved on to be a part of this Artworks, which was a mini series. It's a part of a collaborative effort from collective called Madeline & Co. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of this a little bit later, but the idea of collective was really important to me, or became more important to me over my in addition to exploring kind of a personal perspective of art making. And most recently, this was just last year, the body of work was displayed in Ottawa outdoors, and I really, really enjoyed its activation outside. The initial kind of body of work is presented with framed soil as almost kind of a mourning and a grieving. And I loved how this particular interaction over time, the plants were blooming. And so, you know, almost as like a cycle of life, I really thought that this was a really beautiful kind of meditative way to present the work. Outside of a studio-based practice, there's also an element of travel. And in particular, with this body of work, I had an opportunity to visit Guyana for the first time. It was for my aunt's funeral. My mom had promised that she would never go back to Guyana just for a funeral. She really wanted to go back for a more happy occasion, but it just so happened that it was her first time back since her mother's passing. And my aunt, who was her eldest sister, was the closest thing that I had to a grandmother on my mother's side. So it kind of hit me the same way as I guess it hit my mom after she lost her mother. So this body of work is a reflection of that grieving process, that meditation of space. Again, trying to figure out how I belong, and also trying to understand the colonial histories that's kind of within this particular space. I've always felt, you know, in terms of my identity, being a mixed race individual, living in a variety of spaces, Guyana as a space really feels like a metaphor for myself. It sits in South America, but it's the only English-speaking country within South America. So it's kind of pushing and pulling against where it belongs as well, as a collection, as a people. So this body of work. A view from my cousin's home, as I got to kind of experience the landscape for myself. My Uncle Claude, and a machete and coconut. So again, with this particular series, I also wanted to look at what's kind of remaining in space, what's remaining in the land. This body of work is a continuing series, so I did start shooting it in 2017. The hope is to return back to Guyana and do some more exploration, more contemplation. It has existed and lived in, you know, one series thus far in a public space, but I really hope to kind of go back and flesh out this body of work a little bit more, because I feel like there's a lot to uncover and talk about in relation to not only myself, but my relationship with my family, and again, a little bit more about the space. Here I am speaking in South Korea. I'm still part of an international collective called Intact. And I was just kind of speaking about the power of collaboration, and that on an international scale. In 2019, I created a body of work, riffing off some of the ideas that I experienced in Guyana. I received my grandmother's passport, and I had not had a relationship with her physically. Spiritually, yes. She had existed, you know, in my home through story, through, you know, her presence has always kind of been with us. And so I wanted to kind of meditate a little bit about what that meant. I tried to research about her, and I found holes. It was very, very difficult to find a lot about, you know, where she was from, where she was born, just things that I have access to for my personal life and for my mom's life. And so I kind of went away from the idea of research being that of collected by institutions, and honing in on the idea of research being that of oral histories, memory, nostalgia, things that are shared, you know, between people and passed down in different ways. And I created this portrait of my grandmother in a very uncanny way. So images of where she might have existed, both in Guyana and when she lived later on in life in Montreal, in Quebec. Spices she might have used while she was cooking. The installation has her passport, which I kind of use almost as a portrait itself. But the name on the passport is not my grandmother's name. So officially on her papers, it says her official name was Darky, but her name was Lucille. So the body of the work is called Looking for Lucille. it was presented in the Women Photographs International Archive as part of the residency, which I was really proud of, to be within that collective. And my practice continues to shift and change. Even though I'm definitely a photo-based artist, I like to play with different materials. So here I am learning new techniques. I learned a stitch called the rice stitch, and I think it's such a beautiful metaphor for diaspora. Being almost, I have this image of a bag of rice being split open and people just kind of spilling out in this way, scattered in lumps and pieces, sometimes finding each other, sometimes off alone, but knowing that they come from a particular space, a particular bag of rice. So I'm still meditating on what this means and how this is going to visually show up in my work. So this is some work in process that I was doing. And Looking for Lucille had an opportunity to be part of an international exhibition in Florida as part of the Florida State University exploration of the power of passports and the movement of people. Video work is still such a big part of my practice. Kind of when I get stuck with the still image, I move towards video and kind of go back and forth to kind of free up my mind space in my brain. And then oftentimes the presentation of the work might come up in kind of a multiple approach. But this particular body of work, I had an opportunity to work with my mom yet again. There's a lot of collaboration with family within my practice. And here I'm meditating on the ideas of who she is as an individual, the ideas of emotional labor. And so I have this conversation with her, and overlaid through this video is the voice of Angela Davis. She's giving a lecture in the 1970s about the power and the influence of women in relation to political movements. So I thought it's a really beautiful kind of overlay of my mom as and what she is and who she is. Outside of this idea of motherhood, she is a fully fledged person. And so I had an opportunity to get to speak to her about that and explore her life in relation to that. A little bit of documentary-based work in my practice as well, which again, being a part of a landscape and multiple landscapes, it's really nice to be able to photograph that, especially as a Black female identified woman. I don't often see a lot of Black women in particular who are photojournalists in this way, or landscape artists, especially when I was in school. You study the group of seven, you study a lot of white folks who are kind of doing this work. And when I first became a photographer, that's the type of work that I wanted to do. And so it's really beautiful that I get to kind of intersplice that within my practice. So here's some images of that, reflecting on what it means to be Black in higher education. I'll probably unpack this in conversation, but I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the topics that I explore. Again, really still having a conversation with the history of photography and how my body fits into that history. So within this body of work, Without a Leg to Stand On, I was thinking about a lot of different things, political movements, how Black lives and Black bodies are used and easily kind of almost as if it's easy to kind of sell towards Blackness or sell Blackness as a whole. But are people truly down for the cause? Do we really want to kind of make changes? And so this is a reflection of that meditation. And I was thinking about the history of photography and using film. A lot of film is in my practice. I thought about, I'm starting to lose my words a little bit. So I'm gonna kind of go on, and then we'll come back a little bit through this. The next slide will help me. So Kodak, when film photography became available, Kodak used these Shirley cards to calibrate the colors of the film. And so it used white skin as a normative base. And so I thought about this, as I looked at my family archive and how odd the skin textures kind of looked. And as photography advanced, yes, we have the ability to kind of change these things, but presets still exist even within Photoshop, where the lightening of skin tones is still an occurrence. there was a beautiful an article that I read about, you know, the resurgence of AI and how Black faces are not being recognized in some of those things. So just again, thinking about how Black folks are not really considered in kind of the scope, not just in photography, but kind of in life. It's an afterthought. And then when there's an opportunity to capitalize off of Blackness, then there's this kind of need to kind of include Black people. So this is what the piece is about. Here it is in Barrie, a recent solo exhibition that I had, some images of the work. I wanted to kind of dismantle the Shirley cards, take apart, you know, what Shirley wore. The reason for that change, again, was not for Kodak thinking about how racist perhaps their product was, but because furniture companies were complaining, chocolate companies were complaining because they couldn't effectively advertise what they were selling. It wasn't an accurate kind of depiction of their product. And that was the impetus for change. So within this particular body of work and a lot of my series, I'm thinking about what motivates people to change. There's a video piece accompanied by this work as well, and it's called Also a Chair. So with this body of work, I had the opportunity to visit Paris, maybe in 2019, and I saw the piece, you know, a chair three ways, you know, the conceptual definition of a chair, physical chair, and an image of a chair. And this kind of image, it sat with me. And as I went and I was creating this body of work, I thought about how do we really give people a platform? It's such a tokenizing experience to say that you're given a seat at the table, but you're not given power. So this kind of piece meditates a little bit about that. And again, embroidery, putting my hand into the work is starting to kind of emerge in my practice. Working with collectives such as Women Photograph is definitely a big part of my practice. That collaborative spirit is starting to really emerge. Master Collective is with a good friend of mine, Alex Hong, as we kind of explore the idea of diaspora together. And some work in progress that I'm still kind of contemplating on is this idea of food and place and belonging. So I'll kind of leave it there. I feel like I've kind of rambled a little bit as well. And I want to give space for other people to kind of join in the conversation. So I'll pause here.
Thank you, Faria. And then next up we have Arpita, and I think we've got a little technical glitch with Liz. Do you want, I'm sorry, I don't have your bio
Yeah,
handy
I
here.
can hop
Oh,
in.
there we go.
Sorry. I'm anyways, technical glitches. That's the highlight of the day, I think. Hopefully it's all done. Thank you, Faria. I'm sorry I missed the last little part, but okay, I'll hop into Arpita's bio. So Arpita Shah is a photographic artist based in Eastbourne, UK. She works between photography and film, exploring the fields where culture and identity meet. As an Indian-born artist, Shah spent an earlier part of her life living between India, Ireland, and the Middle East before settling in the UK. This migratory experience is reflected in her practice, which often focuses on the notion of home, belonging, and shifting cultural identities. Shah's work tends to draw from Asian and Eastern mythology, using it both visually and conceptually to explore issues of cultural displacement in the South Asian diaspora. She graduated from Napier University in Edinburgh in 2006. Her work has been exhibited across the UK and internationally, including at the Detroit Centre of Contemporary Photography, Tramway in Glasgow, Chobi Mela in Dhaka, Bangladesh, Autograph APB in London, Street Level in Glasgow, and Impressions Gallery in Bradford. She's the recipient of the 2019 Lightwork Autograph ABP Artist in Residence program in Syracuse, and her work is held at the National Galleries of Scotland and Birmingham Museums. So I will let you take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Liz. And just a quick thanks to Jen and Claire for bringing Freya, Margaret, Liz and me together. And yeah, so I'm going to start off with my slideshow. Hopefully we had some tech glitches. I think I'm the main cause to the tech glitches, so hopefully everything should run smoothly. Okay, let's go. Share screen. So, okay. Is everything looking? I'm gonna thumbs up, Jen. I can see Jen if it's all good. Okay, great.
We've got the full view. Yeah, we're all
Got
good.
the full view. Oh, okay. 1 second. Did it just stop? Oh no. Okay, bear with me. All good. Full view. What's going on? Okay. I think that's what it was on. Can you guys still see?
Okay,
big
there
It's
we
good
go.
now.
Yeah.
Good now.
We're good? Okay, perfect. Thanks. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Arpita, and as Liz had said, I'm based in Eastbourne. For the past 15 years or so, I've been making work that explores themes of cultural identity, migration, experiences of diaspora. I'm really interested in exploring notions of home and belonging. This interest stems from my own personal experiences and background. Again, as Liz had said, I was born in India, and I spent my childhood across India, Ireland, and the Middle East. And so a lot of my work sort of references childhood memories, mainly in India and Saudi. And I sort of use them a lot, reference them a lot in my photography work to evoke these sort of experiences of diaspora, South Asian diaspora. I work predominantly with portraiture photography, and I often collaborate with individuals from diverse cultural backgrounds, particularly women, and just make work that explores some of the complex narratives and complex histories linked to individuals like myself that are displaced between lands, you know, and lands that are steeped in really complex histories. My work often draws from Asian mythology, particularly flora. I use flowers a lot as metaphors to explore the experiences of displacement. Yeah, as a photographer, I'm also really interested in historical representations of South Asian women, particularly in sort of 18th century Mughal miniature paintings. I'm also really interested in European colonial ethnographic photography, and I often sort of reference those in my images, but I like to subvert their original meanings to kind of touch on the complex histories and colonial sort of histories, but look at contemporary identities, particularly of women of color, particularly women of South Asian diaspora. When I was growing up in the 90s and studying photography in the early sort of 2000s in Scotland, there really wasn't much representation of South Asian women in photography at all, like particularly photographs of brown women taken by brown women. And you know, I think it really shaped, I think it affected me a lot when I was growing up, because I really didn't see anyone like me, and I had a very difficult relationship with being brown, and you know, growing sort of similar to stuff that Brian said, sort of growing up in quite a white town, and having very white friends. And so through my photography, you know, I wanted to make images for sort of younger South Asian women, you know, but also for women like my mum and gran, and to sort of celebrate their histories and place them in museums and galleries. So that's what I've been doing for the past sort of 15, 16 years. I think my time is a bit fast, but some of the images you can see now, or that have just started, are portraits of my mum and grandmother. And these, I wanted to show you this body of work because it's the work I was developing in the first sort of round of the FPN residencies. I think I was in Kenya at the time, wasn't I? I think, yeah, I was in Kenya doing a residency for this project called Nalini, which you're seeing images very quickly of. So Nalini is, I might actually, okay, no, I'll just let it keep going. Hold on, can I? think it's going way too fast. I'm just going to show it like this. Is that all right? I'm just going to click. And yeah, you guys can see that, but you can see the screens, but that's fine. We'll just do that. So yeah, Nalini is my grandmother's name, but it's also got double meaning. It means lotus flower, and a lot of my work references flora and sort of particularly Asian flowers to sort of symbolize the experiences of displacement. So Nalini, the lotus flower in Hindu mythology, often references fertility, rebirth, womanhood, and these are all themes that Nalini is exploring. But the main key sort of inspiration behind this project was my grandmother. My grandmother, I started the project, I think in about 2015, and I started it because I'd gone to India, and I think a lot of people that have grandparents sort of in different countries, you don't get to see them that often. And every couple of years I'd see my grandmother, and this particular time I'd gone to India to see her. She'd had hit her head and she was in the hospital and she was in a coma. For almost 2 weeks, I went to visit her every day in hospital and had this really deep guilt and longing that I'd, spent so much time in my career photographing other sort of South Asian women, and I'd never actually pointed the camera inwards to look at, my grandmother. I'd photographed my mother a lot, and she features almost in all my work. But I kind of just thought, God, we were told we might lose her. And so luckily fortunately after 2 weeks, my grandmother, Nalini, she woke up, and I was there when she was waking up, and I was just like, Gran, were you dreaming for 2 weeks? Like, was it pure blackness? Like what happened? You were gone for 2 weeks. And the first thing she said was that she dreamt she was floating in the ocean between India and East Africa and Kenya. And that was the first moment, I suppose, as an artist, that kind of light bulb moment where that visually, it was such a poetic sort of visual imagery in my head. But as a granddaughter, I thought, like, my grandmother had this incredible life in childhood in Africa that I know nothing about. And a lot of the time, I think we just kind of think our parents and grandparents' lives kind of happened when we came and it's sort of linked to us, but they had these incredible experiences in their own journeys. So that kind of inspired the project. And so in the series, I photographed my mum, my grandmother, but also objects that had been passed around through generations. I'd photographed places as well that had sort of cultural significance to the women in my family. And so what I really loved about sort of Nalini was quite different to a lot of my other work. What was one of the great things was being able to chat to so many different artists through FPN to sort of reference and give me feedback as well, because it was such a different, I was very much out of my comfort zone when I was making the work. So it was incredible just chatting to lots of other female practitioners, giving me advice, recommending artists I hadn't looked at before. I think it was Kate that had recommended Sophie Calle, one of her shows, and that really inspired me when I was sort of planning curation for the exhibition. Yeah, I'll just flick through some of the images. I sort of was really interested when Farai was talking about the sort of histories of flora, because that's something I reference a lot in my work. Bougainvilleas reoccur a lot in Nalini because they were sort of originally plants. They weren't original plants in India and East Africa. They were planted during the sort of British rule. And I was really interested in how these certain floras have these sort of colonial links, and how that sort of reflects the experiences of people, sort of South Asian people and sort of communities that had been moved around. So yeah, flora sort of alongside reflecting, sort of representing womanhood and fertility, it's also about sort of migration and the complex migrational routes. Sometimes, yeah, that my family have a history in. But in Nalini, one of the things that was really different from my other work was that I wanted people to feel that kind of longing and that desire to kind of want to go back and turn someone around in an image. So in sort of all of the images, there's something quite tactile where I want people to sort of touch the image or turn my mum around. The image we're looking at right now is my mum sort of visiting her childhood home in India, which the house is gone now, but she's kind of facing where the house used to be. And it was just, yeah, I kind of wanted to create that kind of longing in the images. So everything kind of invites you to touch the images. During the second residency at FPN, it was during lockdown. And it was, yeah, like it was a really interesting time because I discovered just before lockdown I was pregnant with twins, and it felt really organic for me to sort of continue looking sort of inwards towards my family, but not my mother and my grandmother, but me as I was becoming a mother for the first time. So these are just some images that I was making during the residency. And I think, yeah, we'll talk about it a little bit more because I know Liz has got some questions, but I think, yeah, if it wasn't for the FPN residency, I probably wouldn't have got around to taking photos of myself. Like we had these sort of really great sort of not very loose deadlines every month where we had to upload images, and I would be that person like 20 minutes before, like setting up my camera and doing some portraits. So, you know, it's been amazing that it pushed me completely out of my comfort zone again. And, you know, some of these images, yeah, the sort of image with the green, that image, when I was making it, I did imagine this would be part of Nalini because of the sort of lotusy green pond sort of bedding. But then I continued making the images. And so this image is at A Space at the moment with Kate, Flannery and Clear's images in vitrines, and that's opening today. And I've also got some of the other images I made as part of a show called Tether with Jen, which is opening next week. Jen, I forgot, in 2 weeks, I think.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Opening on next week, the end of next week, and then opening reception on the 14th.
Oh, that's it, on the 14th. And so it's got sort of other female artists that exploring motherhood. So we've got April, Natasha, Kelly, Thiola, and Jessica showing at it too. I'll leave it at that because I know we've got to get through some questions and I've been chatting away. So thank you so much. I will stop. I'll stop.
Thank you, Arpita. All right, now I'm excited. I have more questions than we'll definitely get to, and so I'm trying to like rearrange in terms of what order to go in, or maybe how to sandwich some of the questions together. So maybe because Arpita, you were kind of talking about the FPN online residency, and I've been thinking about the types of support that you all have in terms of your lens-based practices, and specifically as female identifying artists in a field that has been one of the slowest to change, I think, in terms of art practices. I'm kind of curious, like what kinds of tactics you've employed to fortify your work, and like what kinds of networks or connections or relationships you build, whether locally or internationally, including FPN. I don't know how if you want to just, whoever wants to like jump in and
yeah. I mean, based in UK, we've got sort of some really exciting women female photography organizations like 100 Heroines and Firecracker that support and champion female photographers. Margaret, I've probably forgotten a few, so if you can remember my brains, but they've been really great in sort of highlighting, yeah, and just sort of championing female photographers. But I think in terms of the residency, just having that, I think a lot of the time once you're out of university, which I've been out of for a long time, that sort of accountability is not the right word, but having that support once a month where, you know, someone, you know, everyone's taking it quite seriously and they're uploading stuff and everyone's taking time to give feedback. It's so precious because when you're, you know, freelance artists and making work in your own pace, you can get stuck, I think, in your own little world, and getting that feedback from other sort of female artists that are exploring themes similar to you or completely different. It's just so rich, the sort of feedback they can give you. And so I think, yeah, I think that's what I really, really miss. And I was chatting to Claire the other day, just saying that I probably wouldn't have been able to do an FPN residency when the twins had come, but I wish I had, because I probably would have taken more pictures, you know, so I think, chime in.
Oh no, is this Arpita or is this me? Oh, you're back.
I think it's Arpita. I think Arpita froze.
Oh my goodness. I'm going to mute mine and let someone else talk.
Okay, well, we just missed the last maybe short few seconds of what you said, but
Okay.
I'll
I
see.
think I was probably just rambling on, but I'll let Margaret and Faria, anything you guys want to add?
I mean, I just sort of, say the same thing in some ways, that I think it's a very isolating place to be sometimes when you're, doing your own practice, especially within like photography work, or if you're working on quite long-term projects, which you might stick up in your wall to try and edit, you might try and do all these things, and in some ways I like to have that kind of in-depth kind of relationship with my work as well, where I'm trying to work it out, before I would take it out. But I found that doing the online residencies takes you out of your own world, and I think that's really important, because it doesn't matter if you take a long time to produce your work, or things that go over this period of time. I think that being able to clock in once a month, look at somebody else's work, which is perhaps not the same kind of work that you're doing, it takes you out of your own space in your mind. I think that's really, really important, to actually consider all these different ways that people are approaching work. And I found that really, really, really rich, basically, when we were doing the residency. And it also made me think about how I could react to people's work and discuss their work back to them and give them feedback from my kind of own practice, So I found it a really important thing, that I was doing at the time. And I mean, some of the projects that I was doing, I've still not released them, So I think and for me, that's been important, because I've thought about them, but I'm just about to release them as well. So I think that it's difficult for me to say because I haven't shown everything, but I just want to say it was a really rich experience.
And I just want to add very briefly, the iteration of the residency that I had was during COVID as well. So the feeling of isolation was just, it had doubled down. We weren't able to see, work in person. I wasn't able to see, everybody wasn't able to see kind of like friends and family. And so to have a community online, to get to know each other better, some of the conversations went beyond the platform. We would be like make calls with each other. So it became more than just making work for me. It became an opportunity to really get to know people again, in a different format, as we were all trying to force ourselves in, or try to understand this idea of like social engagement. Like, what does that mean when the world is shifting in such a weird way? What type of opportunities does that create? And it was also very beautiful that the residency is international as well, because you have conversations of I'm experiencing the same thing. So that's a lovely kind of moment of camaraderie, I think, within the space.
Yeah, it's so interesting too. I think about those kinds of connections, and how usually too it requires a certain level of trust, especially with critique, and how that process is often not kind of acknowledged at how important it is to kind of lay that groundwork of being able to kind of trust the network that you're working with. And I'm sure that like starting where you're already, the foundation is there in terms of why you're all there, to slowly be able to kind of create those really solid connections. It's really beautiful. I also, so yeah, I think I want to jump into this question that maybe is a little big, but each of your practices are really quite distinct and varying. But I still see there's a through line of an exploration of belonging, movement, and or displacement. And I'm really curious as to the process of how you come to the themes or concepts that you're working on, and what's your process of research. You've all kind of touched on that to a certain degree, but I think it was really interesting, like Faria, that it sounds like you have a very clear process that you follow. And I'm just curious if you all kind of have that sense, or if there's a more kind of intuitive or chaotic process, whatever. Yeah, whoever wants to hop into that.
Shall I answer first?
Yeah.
I think that I work in quite an organic way, really, in a lot of my projects. So, I mean, I do think that I work in sort of project-based photography, but I also work on things which may evolve over a period of years, even if they seem to be standalone portraits, for example. I do a lot of work around childhood, but which is built up, you know, over a long period of time. And I think that you know, just sorry, my brain has kind of gone. I started talking about something else. Sorry, what am I answering? No, I'm completely lost.
What your like your research process.
My research.
Yeah.
I started talking about my, you know, the general sort of part of it. So the research, I mean, I think it's about observation, and even though you might not actually be actively photographing on a project, it can take years of observation to be getting pulled into topics that really, really interest you. And these might be social questions, there might be political questions, there might be psychological questions, but they're all pulling you in, and you're kind of noting it sometimes in your mind, sometimes you're writing them down, doing workbooks, and then suddenly you think, okay, that's the project starting. And I did that, I guess, with my family project that started in '94. And it went on where I went back and revisited that project starting again in 2015. And it was kind of like this push where I just couldn't, it was like an itch, and I just couldn't sort of ignore it any longer. I had to sort of start on it photographically, but it took me a year of discussing it with the family before I actually started photographing. So even though in Easter 2015, I was talking with them about it, it wasn't until a year later that I actually started the photographs. And that's a really important part of that process, because it's about that responsibility in photography and about actually listening to people and taking their sort of opinions on board. And then that project, actually, a lot of the themes from that project led on to An Ordinary Eden. So I feel like the research is kind of, you know, it kind of just continues, because you're pulling from all these different strands that are all interconnected a little bit.
I'll just go in, but yeah, I feel like with my process there, it's sort of similar to Margaret's, and I think in terms of that, it's sort of manifestations of really similar themes, and they kind of go out into sort of different approaches and different ways of collaboration, but the core is always sort of, I think, really rooted for me in my own questions of belonging and my own sort of complex sort of relationship with my own identity. And so I'm really drawn to people that have similar narratives to me, whether I create these sort of digital sort of photographic spaces in these worlds where I kind of can connect to other people. So yeah, I feel like for me, it's always kind of rooted in my own experiences. But in terms of making work, a lot of my images, when I start a project, I'll often sort of reference paintings, and there'll be particular paintings and imagery I have in my mind, and I'll sort of research into the histories of them and the meanings, and then usually sort of connect something with that sort of history to sort of what the themes I want to explore. So it is a bit sort of quite planned, but then, you know, it depends on the project. I'm currently working with a group of young refugee men, and it's a lot more collaborative in nature, and this project's been very different to my usual pattern. So I think it's also dependent on sort of what groups you're working with. But I think when I was showing some images from Nalini, one of the really interesting things was that through photography, I think that connection, I think connection's a really important word sort of when you're making portraits about people or photographing your family and looking for that connection. And my grandmother and I, we communicate sort of in Gujarati, but my Gujarati language, mother tongue's not very, I can't articulate myself like an adult in it. I sound like a 5-year-old. And I feel like with my grandmother, whenever we spoke, my mum or my aunt would translate. But when I made this body of work, we'd spent hours together, and there was this intimacy that was created that language didn't do for us, and we created our own little world. And you know, that now that bonded us, the fact that, you know, I would just follow her around and photograph her. And I feel like, yeah, like photography kind of breaks these boundaries and creates these really intimate connections that regardless of language or sort of backgrounds, there's something you create together. And I really love working with photography because of that.
Maria, did you want to?
Sure. Yeah. I was thinking about kind of what I shared a little bit earlier about just kind of being around images all the time. And so there's for me a need to want to respond to things in a way. And so like Margaret, this idea of a spark or something that kind of happens, although I think I'm able to like share, yes, these are the methods that I use to kind of break down an idea. It's kind of the same way, this organic feeling of I want to investigate something a little bit more, or there are some questions, maybe large questions that I want to answer, and I'm still trying to answer about, my identity, my place, my belonging, who I am and who I'm meant to become, these kind of questions, especially when I have holes in my history to not know, exactly where folks from my family may have gone or come from, or these types of things. So yeah, this idea of like a really deep meditation of things is a big part of kind of the research process for me as well.
I was just really struck by also Margaret, how you had at one point you were talking about like returning to your archives and work that's in process, or that is kind of, maybe you haven't answered a question, and then Freya, you work with archival imagery and histories, and the same with you, Arpita, working with archives. So I was really thinking about, is it important for you all to return to your previous work and really like kind of take a different, or be able to see a different perspective on that work? I really loved, Margaret, it sounds like you have a relationship with your archives in terms of that they shift and change, and they also inform your practice going forward. So I'm just, yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys think.
I mean, I think that, it's really suddenly I realized that actually the work that I did was quite a long time ago, and it was archive work. And I don't know at what stage in my career I realized that, and I think that being able to sort of put it all together and look at it, and then look at all these connections that are happening between work that I do nowadays and work that I did then. Back in 1993, I was photographing in youth clubs, and nowadays, in 2019, I was doing the same thing, and I was going back and I was getting pulled back into these same kind of topics and themes, because perhaps I hadn't explored them well enough back in the 90s when I was a student. But maybe that wasn't the right time for me to be working in that. It was quite a surface level that I worked on it, and I feel that I wanted to still work in those themes, but go into that more in depth. And so I went into the youth clubs, and I did more participatory work as well at the same time I was doing that. And I did work where I came out of the youth club, and then I followed the young people, and I followed to look at what their sense of place was like outside of this sort of safe space. So it wasn't just a sort of everyday run-of-the-mill youth club, for example. It was a safe space within an area of disadvantage, basically. And so it was about really interesting to look back at that earlier work, but to see how it's evolved in a way, how those ideas have evolved, and how I've sort of still working thematically, perhaps, with things that I did, a long time ago, but that I try to be better, basically. Better towards other people. I feel that I bear that responsibility of how I work with people in a much more serious way than I was when I was a student. But then maybe that's not surprising, because I was really young, so I don't think that I should feel like I should sort of judge myself too harshly for that either.
I'll just sort of continue with while it's fresh in my head, but with what Margaret's saying again, yeah, I feel like sort of ethics. I mean, there's more discourse around collaboration and sort of ethics around photography to back when, even when I was studying photography, where there was just no discourse around agency, you know, the responsibility you have when you're representing the voices of others. And, you know, this has all emerged a lot more now, which is so important. But I feel like, yeah, sort of looking back at work I made when I was at university, the sort of underpinning themes have always been kind of looking at home and identity. So I think they just sort of manifest into other, into sort of different forms. But yeah, I've lost my chain of thought, but I wanted to talk a little bit about, yeah, just that area of, but in terms of collaboration, I know one of your questions that you sort of mentioned was looking at, when you emailed us, was looking at sort of collaboration. And for me in my work, a lot of the time, forms of collaboration can sort of vary from me inviting the women I photograph, particularly South Asian women, to sort of choose what clothes they want to wear in the shoots, to a lot of my recent work now, alongside giving them sort of agency through their choice of clothing, is also using text a lot, and sort of interviews where, you know, I'll ask them, we'll have conversations, and then there'll be a whole dialogue with them, where I'll sort of select a bit of text, see if they approve or if they want to select something else. So sort of working with text and image is something that I feel like, yeah, like I sort of didn't really think about sort of earlier on in my career, but now with sort of responsibility you have when you're sharing the stories and representing other people, making sure there's like this equal equal sort of balance between making sure you portray them the way they want to be seen. And I think, yeah, that's something that I find really interesting now, where we are now in photography.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly add on to that. I have difficulties putting an end date on a lot of my works. You know, the body of work that I started called Along the Demerara, I started shooting it in 2017, but it's not finished for me. So I find yeah, I'm still trying to come to grips with the ability to just allow the practice to grow, and give it the space that it may need to, you know, for me to reflect on, you know, what I've shot. What does it mean as I grow as an individual? How does the perspective change as I research more about space? You know, how does it better inform the work? So I think just embracing that some of the body of work that I've created thus far can be a little bit more open-ended. It's both scary and a bit exciting. So, you know, looking forward to having some more meditations around the work. And I think in the residency, as there was moments of kind of like in between of, you know, feeling like, oh, this month I really haven't shot anything. There was a resurgence of that, like, oh, why don't you look at some of your past bodies of work? So I really appreciate, you know, space, just kind of coming back to the idea of the residency through that, to allow us to kind of like think about our work as an archive already.
Which kind of leads to, I mean, like, Arpita, you kind of touching on like the next question, which also kind of is mixed in with archives too. When I think about consent or non-consent, and specifically through the history of photography, because I think the ethics of photography is a pretty recent conversation that's being had. And so, you know, whether we kind of see the representation in front of the camera and behind the camera, I think about the complicated history of Dorothea Lange's migrant mother, and also thinking about Ariella Azoulay's description of the civil contract of photography, kind of as our responsibility to see and to document people's experiences in the world, and how and so I'm thinking about how you see yourselves as creators and collaborators, and also I think, and with active participants that can be yourself as well. I think what I'm interested in terms of where the conversation's gone so far is that contract with your collaborators, it's always open-ended, right? Like, and I think it's interesting that you all kind of talked about maybe at the beginning of your careers, or that that's something that was new and maybe you would approach things differently. I'm wondering if there's ever been a situation where you're like, oh, do I want to show that work now? Because maybe I'm, not as comfortable with the form of consent I had with a subject, or maybe I'd want to revisit a conversation with the subject, or maybe it's just, you just decide not to pursue a direction for whatever reason. Yeah. So anyone want to jump in?
I do. There was a particular kind of towards the end of the residency, there was this work in progress type of work that I started on, which I started to photograph, relationships that I had with a good friend of mine who lives in France. But as I was, shooting, and as I was writing about the work, I was like, this is not my story to tell, and not in this way, and maybe not yet, maybe not ever. And it ended up just being, a portrait of them and his brother. And I don't know where that work will ever go, if it's just kind of like a gift now to him and his brother, as perhaps that's as much as it needs to go. I think I'm still, thinking about the idea of how I work with people, especially because my practice has really shifted into that of, photographing myself and really close family members who I'm gaining consent all the time. And so I'm still kind of grappling with the idea of working with folks outside of myself and different communities. And again, can I be a part of the story, or how can I be a part of this story in a way that feels right for everybody involved, and trying to navigate that. So I'll kind of like leave it there for folks to join in on.
I don't know, Margaret, should I go?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay. I feel like we could have a whole different talk around this topic. It's very rich, but something quickly that sort of popped to mind was when I was making Nalini, because it was such personal work, and I was documenting my grandmother sort of day-to-day activities. There were sort of certain images where she had like a towel and sort of wrapped in her shoulders there. And when it came to like editing for the show, I felt like, my role as a granddaughter, like I knew as an Asian woman, she wouldn't maybe want that image, even though she'd said, grandparents are great. She was just like, I love you, whatever you want to use. But I knew as a South Asian sort of elderly woman, she wouldn't want that. So it was really interesting sort of navigating between my sort of, like hat as a photographer, wanting to show this sort of fragility of her skin and vulnerability, but as a granddaughter, knowing like that she would not be down with like, that honor. So it was really interesting. I think, ethics and sort of even getting that consent, the ethics sort of vary a lot with work, and, from project to project. But I feel like, I've actually sort of, I won't go into too much, but there have been times it shows, in projects where, women have wanted to have their work taken down, and, and that's absolutely, something I've learned from. And I think that happens in sort of a lot of people's careers, whether it's being published or online, people do have the right to change their mind. And I think when I was being taught photography, this was just kind of like you were told, you just get a form signed and that's it. And now as I've grown older, I've understood that, consent isn't just getting a signature. It's kind of letting people know where the images are going to go, showing them like this might be on a billboard, and making sure, and also having a sort of transparency, complete transparency in the places the work can be shown. But I think in terms of archival work, I think it's something very personal, and, whether to show things or not, but laws change, GDPR laws change. So I think as long as there's transparency, you have, oh, hello? Is someone joining in our conversation? No? Okay. You can say something if you want, Hannah. I think it was, okay. I think because it does change, but I think now in my practice, it's just making sure I'm clear that people do have the opportunity to withdraw if they want to, and just having like a sort of fine print around that, but them understanding if the work's been sort of exhibited or documented or published, that can't disappear. But from now on, just having transparency, but from now on, these images won't be shown I think, that's kind of like how I work, but it's learning every day. It's so different with every community and every individual, and, the responsibility. I think it does weigh on you. Like Freya was saying, it's just like always kind of questioning if you're the right person to tell the story. But I think whether you're sort of inside that community. Outside, there's kind of different perspectives and it shouldn't put people off, but it's just being really honest and transparent always, and making sure people have the option to say no even after the image is taken. And that's, I think, really important in my practice and something I've learned throughout my Margaret, Hannah sent a message.
I think I would just like to sort of add a little bit about how you know, I take my responsibility of working with people very deeply, and I have a real process in working with people when I'm working on you know, quite sort of issues-based work, as you know, people might want to term them, and I think that a lot of it is actually just being human and actually being able to relate to people and build relationships and treating them with respect and explaining exactly what you're doing. I go back with photographs to people, I show them photographs, I talk about that editing process. I sometimes tell them why I'm taking photographs out, because I'm kind of acting how I'm you know, sort of trying to understand how an audience might see this. And so I drop photographs for that reason. But it's also about keeping people informed. I mean, this week I spent an afternoon in a hospice with people that I worked with last year. And I didn't go in as a photographer. I didn't go in order to take photographs. I went in to actually show them photographs that are going to be shown in an exhibition. You know, they've had all these photographs, they've seen copies of them as they've been getting done. But I think it's really important to understand that sometimes those relationships don't end when you've taken those pictures and you've edited them and you've put them somewhere, that actually those relationships continue, and you have that responsibility to actually keep continuing, because it's about respecting people. And so yeah, I think that I try to be mindful of that across all my work, and to build those relationships with people in general.
It's so interesting because I keep thinking about the fact that that process of kind of ongoing and open consent and kind of continuing relationships is really about sharing power and sharing the like the act of control, and that is something that I think is also particularly more easy or more accessible for women to do, because that is something that we have experienced the opposite of for so long, that that sharing in that is really I think in some ways second nature, but it's really it's really, I think, exciting to see. And also I think there's Arpita, like in terms of with your grandmother, I think there's something really particularly interesting about knowing that your grandmother gave consent and said, you know, do what you want, but you also made a decision that that was beyond, because I think that there's times where there is consent, where people have said, yeah, for sure, you can show my work or whatever. And that you also have to have an inner dialogue in terms of, do I want to show this work? Am I showing a certain vulnerability or, you know, whatnot? And Freya, you know, you mentioned that, like with, I believe it's two brothers that you photographed, like that you decided, okay, this is like that consent isn't just external, it's also like a conversation that you're having internally with yourself too, which I think is really great. I'm happy to see that this conversation keeps being had more and more publicly. I know when I've been teaching, that it's been an interesting conversation. I was teaching a fourth year undergrad class, and the students really had a very developed understanding of that. And then I was also teaching a continuing ed class, and that class had a lot of older students that were really challenged with this idea of ongoing consent. They were like, but no. And I think it's really around the history of the idea of taking photos and like our ideas of what a photographer does. Anyways, yada yadas. I'm gonna keep going. Okay, so maybe, yeah, one or two more questions, and then I think we should maybe open it up. So I think, okay, so I have a couple questions. I'll just float through some of these. I'm kind of curious about the hyperspeed of different photo technologies and how they affect your practices. I think all of you work in film, analog processes, and it feels like there's time that is reflected, and a slowing down and really kind of getting to a tactile quality of photography that I'm personally always drawn to. But it's really interesting because it's really counter to the proliferation of images online and through social media. And then we could also like jump into DALL-E and like AI. But I'm just curious about that. Do you think that your relationship to kind of that super proliferation of photography and digital photography, like how does that affect your practice or the way that you think about your work, and specifically working in film?
Everyone's being really polite. Freya, you go first, Priya.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I kind of see it in twofold. Like for me personally, I really enjoy the process of working with analog. It might be challenged now because of the price of film. I might have to be a little bit more conscious of how I'm using that. And so, shifting to using digital processes might just be from an economic standpoint for me personally. But if I can still afford it, and if I can, that's going to be my preference of making. I'm curious as how, the viewer is going to impact my work. Now that there are different ways to kind of make work, what's the value of photography going to look like? I think there's always this question of like, those who use film are this particular caliber of photographer, and those who use digital are this, there's these weird kind of back and forth conversations of that. So I wonder kind of what the implications will be for the viewer to be like, I can create something like that with these types of technologies. But I don't know, it's both interesting and a strange place. In the body of work that I was producing for within the residency, I thought about, the use of AI technology, and again, people are still behind those processes. So I'm also curious about like the conversations and what's happening behind those types of technologies, who's in control of them. Again, we have an opportunity to kind of shift and use technology for good, but will it be this kind of corrupt, weird space? These are some things that I kind of think about when new technologies are kind of brought up. But me personally, I think film will always be kind of a preference. So I'll kind of leave it there for folks.
I work on my personal projects, mostly on film, but I work a lot on digital as well. I basically work whatever is needed for the situation. And one of the projects that I had to do recently, it was all, photographed digitally. And it's quite interesting to work in different ways sometimes. And I think it opens up different creative spaces for yourself, and you realize different ways that you work as well. So I think that's interesting. And I think my worry as well is, also this economic kind of worry. I mean, film has become, halfway through my project, it became, sky high, and sometimes I couldn't get film, or I couldn't get it processed and things like that. So there was some additional kind of problems which weren't to do with that, more the creative side, but more about that actual practical side of it as well. And so I try not to be too picky about how I'm trying to create work. I try to think about how I can actually get there to try and to get to the end part. And I think that, talking about AI and that is actually quite interesting. I'm very intrigued by it all. I'm a little bit worried by it, especially within, photojournalism, and looking at how, the issues that throws up. And I think that there's been quite a lot of work already sort of done around that, like Jonas Bendixsen's work, who did, you know, the fake news in his book. And I thought that was a really smart project because it was really addressing all those issues. And then there's the guy recently, which was in the, I think it was at Sony, who for one of their awards, he has as you know, it's from AI as well. So the pictures are created image in this way. So I think these are throwing up. It's a bit of a brave new world, isn't it? And it's throwing up all these questions for us at the moment about what photography is in a sense, or what are the future for that. And I don't think there's a definite answer out there quite yet. I think it's very young, and but it's definitely something which is intriguing, and but you know, I'll keep sort of reading about, but I don't think I would use it in my own work. For example, I'm not worried about it in the context of my own work at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'll only say a little bit, but clearly from my PowerPoint, the little drama, I'm really bad with technology. So like I'm very old school analog, but I think one of the things we're sort of wanted to say about analog is that sort of that, again, going back to that sort of relationship between sitter and sort of photographer, is like, I love how slow the process is when, you know, because film is very expensive, it's usually one roll, 10 frames, if I've got a portrait session, you know, with somebody, and it's a long hour of conversation, and it really slows you down. And like Freya said, you can't, you know, the relationship changes when I think somebody wants to see their image like right away, especially when you're in the process of making a new body of work and you don't really know how the project's going to turn out. So it adds like a different dynamic, and like I love it to just remain that sort of process of you and them when you're making the image. However, again, mentioning Nalini, when I was making work about my grandmother, because she was really unwell, she was quite shaky, and like it can be very static with a sort of large format or medium format camera to have it on a tripod, and it wasn't working. So I actually started shooting some images more digitally, and it allowed this more fluid sort of process of me being able to get into areas, you know, like smaller corners, and being able to be more organic with the images that were emerging. So it was really interesting. That was the first time in sort of years I'd sort of thought I would sort of shoot with digital, because I've always just been very formal portraits, you know, on a tripod. So I really liked how it sort of, pushed me out of my comfort zone. And also, like Margaret was saying, it depends on what situation you're in and how to kind of work with that. So a bit, but yeah, I love working slowly with film, because I don't really know what I'm making most of the time, and I need that time to go process it. And the slowness is nice, especially with social media and all these images we're so, you know, oversaturated with. It's nice. So
yeah, it's really interesting in terms of like also the like just the being a lens-based practitioner. I feel like there's also something that you know, is connected to your identity in terms of when I think about like the proliferation of AI, or like the proliferation of just digital photography, or like the fact that, you know, there's really wonderful, you know, high school students that are photographers in terms of using their phones and posting on Instagram, and that is amazing, because there's a community for every type of person, and that it eradicates that kind of sense of you know, I feel like the time of the like celebrity photographer, that when I was going to school, that was, you know, we knew all the photographers like the Annie Leibovitz and you know, whoever, that seems to be kind of dispelled, or because of this. But then the complete removal of authorship with AI is also like, I guess that's something that I'm questioning now in terms of what does that do? I don't think anyone knows really. And that's the part that's just a little bit terrifying, because now, I mean, it just feels like it moves so quickly, that there isn't really an amount of time where we get to reflect and consider like, what are the implications of these kinds of things in terms of how they're going to be in our news media. How are we going to kind of, anyways, it really, is something I'm fascinated by and totally terrified of. And we'll see, probably tomorrow. Like, I feel like I heard about DALL-E like a few months ago, and now it's everywhere. So I think this will be kind of my last question, and then I'll just, see if anybody else has any questions, or or maybe too, if you have questions for each other. One of the, I think, trends, I don't know if it's a trend, but like that I see a lot lately, which I really love, is that there's this interesting relationship between photography and other media, like whether it's textile, film and video, audio, ceramics. Like, I just really have been seeing so many different interesting relationships with photography that have been explored. And I'm curious in terms of if that, well, I know that that's prevalent in all of your practice. And so I'm kind of, I'm curious how you think about those kind of other iterations in terms of what the relationship to other media is and photography.
I'll give a wee answer about, just because I'm finalizing a website basically, and I think that even though it's not, within this website, we're looking at things like books. So I'm going to have a book, I'm going to have a website, I'm going to have short videos, which are mostly like slideshow videos with narration, and I'm going to have photographs. And so this is, for me, it's about trying to tell a story through as many, through bringing in as many kind of elements as possible, because sometimes I don't feel like the image on its own is capable of doing it. So sometimes I would use image and text, but now, with when projects become more in depth, I feel like, oh, let's, I really need to add in something which really explains that a little bit better. So I'm going to add in this other element of it as well. And I think one thing that we did in one of the FPN exhibits, which I thought was really useful, was I did like a diary of a process, of all my process photographs of actually how I work basically. And I think that was used in the exhibition as well. And I think that sort of bringing in these different elements, for me, I feel like I'm then presenting it to a viewer in a more rounded fashion. So not just the photographs, mounted on a wall in a frame with a title, but actually trying to give this rounder experience, I guess, from using different elements.
Yeah, I feel just sort of continuing with what Margaret was saying. Yeah, sometimes photographs, particularly when you're telling the stories of others, and like photographs sometimes for me haven't felt enough. So sort of combining it with text has been really important. But a couple of years ago, I was commissioned to make work in the Isle of Harris, like in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, around the Asian Hebridean community. And so I was commissioned to make portraits of, it's got this really interesting history with a lot of families from Pakistani communities settling in this tiny island in sort of the Outer Hebrides, and then getting family to come. And at one point in the sort of 70s and 80s, there was over 100 of them. And then their kids have kind of moved to the mainland. So there's all these sort of really interesting oral histories that are being forgotten. And so when I was interviewing the families, I was planning to make photographs with them, but I found actually the conversations and this sort of ritual of having chai was so precious that I'd sort of gone back to the gallery that commissioned me and was like, guys, I'm not going to make portraits, but I want us to have a traveling, touring Indian tea stall, and I want it to sort of play the interviews, and I sort of worked with the families. The gallery were great. They'd known me and they were very flexible and were like, okay, whatever you want to do. So we had this, so instead of, like, I felt like we used, during the interviews, we used archival photographs as starting points for the conversation. So in the installation of the tea stall, we had archival photographs from their family albums, but the project just didn't feel like, the portraits and the images I was making just didn't encapsulate these really rich stories. And so I think that was one of the first times I felt like photography couldn't kind of put across, that emotion and feeling. And, when you're talking about migration and diaspora, so much of it is based on senses and sounds. And so that, this tea stall toured around the island, and you had Indian chai, but the sounds were sort of their stories. And they'd also picked sounds from India and sounds from the Isle of Harris. So it was fused with sort of street sounds from Kolkata to starlings in the Isle of Harris. And it was just kind of, I think, similar themes to all my work about that experience, but it was all on the senses. And I found, at the moment, as I mentioned, I'm working with a group of men from refugee asylum backgrounds, and they've been making images, I've been making images, but again, the stories they're not sort of coming across. And I feel like we kind of found with language as well, the men have been interviewing other men, and the stories that they say in their mother tongue, it's so different to when they're sort of still learning English, it's very different. So it's really interesting. I think it's really important to work with different mediums and kind of go with what feels right. And that's sort of, I think sound is something, is always something I'm always really drawn to, just because of my own sort of memories and sort of sparks I get when certain things remind you of home or certain smells. So
yeah,
thanks.
I feel like documentation of, things that manifest photography can always be a part of that particular process. And whenever I kind of veer away from the still image, I still kind of look like a photographer in a way, like I'm setting up a stage in a particular way, or, just kind of the angle of things. So I think there's still that intuition that kind of comes through from that skill of being a photographer. But I love how it can be manifested in so many different mediums. So I quite enjoy the crossover things. I struggled so much while I was a student to just select one major. And even to this day, this is the reason why I prefer to say I'm a lens-based photographer or a lens-based artist, so I can have the opportunity to kind of navigate and move through spaces. And it's quite a beautiful process. But I still think with the training that we have as photographers, or the art of looking can be applied in so many different ways. So I think there's still lots of connection to photography as a medium, but it doesn't necessarily need to manifest as a still image.
I agree. It's really, it's really great in terms of the way that it, I feel like photography can be like, there's like this expansion that can come from an image in relation with audio, or, all of these things. And I think finding those ways to create embodied experiences for an audience is so exciting. I think now that we're kind of also in another generation of getting away from the traditional ideas of the way that we engage with art in like kind of in a wide way, whether it's going to museums and whatnot. I feel like there's a lot of questioning or challenging those ideas of like walking in and looking at art and being like, that's a painting. Okay, great. I can tell people I've seen that painting or that photograph or whatnot. So I really love that now there's more of a consideration of how do we look at work, and what does that work mean and do for ourselves, and how does that represent how we see the world, or how someone else sees the world, and how connected or different that is. Thank you all so much. This has been a really great conversation. And does anybody have any questions they want to? I mean, I'm just going to open this up to everybody that's here, including Margaret, Faria, and Arpita. If you have questions for each other too, I'd love to hear it. And Jen and Claire. And maybe while like, I'll just see if there's any questions that pop up, and in the interim, as a kind of last thing, but please, anyone jump in. I'm curious about your interest in mentorship in terms of mentoring others or being a mentee. I think that sharing kind of your skills and that is really interesting in terms of legacy and how you've all developed your practices. Did you have mentors? what's your relationship with mentors?
I'll start because my mentor's in the room. Hello,
Ah.
Jen Long. Jen was my thesis advisor while I was a student at OCAD. So it's kind of cool, this relationship that we've been able to have over the years. So I've had a really amazing, strong mentor in my life through Jen. And I've been able to pass that on in a few different programs that have come up over the years. So in Toronto, I think it's bigger than Toronto now, because I feel like there are some photographers who are outside of Toronto and Ontario and Canada. But the BIPOC photography mentorship program has been a really lovely program that I've been mentoring. I've been a part of and been mentoring a few folks coming into the field. It's been really lovely because they not all have formal education in photography. So yeah, that's been a really great experience. The collective that I'm a part of now feels like a mentorship. There's just two of us in the collective, and I feel like we're constantly sharing skills and learning about each other in that process. So I feel like mentorship has also kind of come up in that way of collaboration. So I'm really excited to continue that process.
I think I do, like, mentorship wise now. I do a lot of I really like to promote people in Scotland who are working in Scotland as well. I did a website which is at the moment it's on a little bit of it's hibernating. It's called The Story Portrait, where I invited people to contribute a story around a portrait that they've done. And so that was one way that I was trying to sort of share different people's work with a sort of a wider audience. And I mean, other things that I do is sort of I go into universities, or I do Zooms with universities and talk to students there. And I also get quite a lot of students who want to maybe do long-term mentorship, which I can't always do. Unfortunately, I just don't have the time for it. But I always try and offer a one-off conversation, either by Zoom or by phone, so that at least we can sort of talk about some of the things that why they wanted to contact me, basically. So I always try to be as helpful as possible. And I mean, I am drawn a little bit to people from similar backgrounds to myself, I have to say, because I feel like I could have benefited from that at that time, and I didn't have it, basically. So I think that it would have been something, as someone coming from a working class background, who I would really have appreciated having someone there who can actually just give you that little bit of a bolster. Yeah.
Yeah, similar to Margaret, I sort of do talks for students at uni. Sort of, I think what's great is post COVID is that you don't have to go visit the unis now, which is great for me because of the twins. So I'm doing talks, but I also sort of teach at Open College of Arts. And last year, me and Savannah Dodd, the founder of Photo Ethics, we sort of co-authored a sort of unit around ethics of portraiture, where we had Margaret do a lecture for our students, which was amazing. It was such a powerful talk. I always love hearing Margaret speak. So that was really great. And I think a lot of the time, yeah, for these sort of talking about sort of ethics around portraiture, just from my experiences, some sort of difficult ones, I'm always very, very open, like in interviews or talks about things I've learned, because these things, sort of conversations, weren't really had at university. And I think a lot of the time, if they're not had, how are people meant to learn and discuss them? So I try and be completely honest, yeah, just with sort of, yeah, the goods and bads of what I've learned and how to move forward. But Claire and I wouldn't say Claire's my mentor, but I feel like sometimes she is like my life mentor. But we studied together actually in Edinburgh, and both of us, we'd gone on an exchange at Ryerson in 2004, was it, Claire, or 2003? And then Claire just let me come back to Scotland on my own. And so she just stayed in Canada ever since. But we have had an amazing, I think, relationship, sort of, that, you know, as students and as photographers. And I think that friendship, I think of her as like a photo sister to me in every project and show. You know, it's been amazing. And I think through FPN as well, connecting with Jen and you know, other artists. It's been, I think these communities are so important, because yeah, going back to what Margaret said earlier on, it can be very lonely in photography sometimes. And so I think it's great, yeah, that it's so important for these FPN and organizations to sort of keep going, to sort of keep these conversations fresh and, you know, inspire everyone.
Yeah, it's really, yeah, I really just want to big up Jen and Claire, because FPN is really amazing. And I think too, lately I've been really thinking about mentorship in terms of, I wish there was just a different word, or like something that's in between mentorship, and because I think that there's often these exchanges with a mentor and a mentee where it goes back and forth, it's fluid, it's not just one directional. And I think FPN is one of those platforms that creates those connections and those forms of exchange that are so important. And I think especially too in photography, I think sometimes when there is a lack of a formal mentorship, it can feel like you've kind of all said, like it can feel really isolating, or really you can feel quite alone in that process. So it's something like truly profound in terms of what you've created. And I'm just so happy to see it continue, and that you've got a CCA grant to continue it also in real life as well. I think maybe I'll just leave it there and just thank you, Margaret, Faria, and Arpita. This was such a great conversation, and I've really loved hearing more about all of your practices. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Liz, yeah, and Claire and Jen and everyone.
And
Thanks,
thank you all.
everyone.